Hello everybody, thanks for joining me again. Today we're discussing Viking leather crafts. So, to begin, I want to give some general leather advice and give some insight into my mindset for making leatherwork for Viking reenactment. That would also include some of the tools I use. We'll go over the tools, we'll go over some of my methods, some of my techniques. We'll also discuss the history a bit. And just to preface, this isn't going to be a general lesson for leatherwork in general. There's a lot of great info out there. Tandy Leather is a pretty big supplier in the United States of everything you would need for leatherwork. They have a very detailed YouTube channel, for just about every tool they sell, and hardware even. So they have tutorials and lessons on how to use each individual piece. So for example, this is a head knife from Tandy Leather, and they have a video discussing this and what it's good for, something I use, something we'll go over. So for certain general leather advice, look elsewhere, but we're going to talk just a little bit about the tools I use and how I will create a piece in our camp settings. So to begin, there's not a lot of leather work that we have to go off of when it comes to preparing a leather piece that's a good replica of historical leatherwork from the Viking Age. There is a few things. A lot of the stuff we find is mostly the metalwork that was once on those pieces. So we can just kind of generally assume the shapes, the sizes, based off the fittings. Some of that stuff might even be to say that it might not actually be what we think it is. There's even pouches that we think could be ornate saddlery leatherwork. But for shoes, footwear, we do have some examples, thankfully. Leather just doesn't survive the test of time. Most organic material doesn't. It's hard to find wood. It's hard to find leather, fabric. A lot of that stuff doesn't survive. Metals, too, depending on the conditions it's in. So we have lots of bronze fittings, and silver, too, that we're able to kind of get general ideas on what the shape of a piece should be. So, for example, we have the birka bag, which is kind of our little pouch. This is an enlarged version. Here's a piece of it. It's not complete. This is probably about 40% enlarged from the actual finds, but they were kind of this general shape, and they had a strap and a bridge that held it shut. So when I make these pieces, they're very much an interpretation off of what these general shapes are. So my pieces in general, they're not covered in a lot of ornate metals, so I like to kind of set them as middle-class persona pieces. Most of them are. I've done some that are a little more decorated. So just to go a little more along, some of the tools I use. Now, some of these aren't going to be particularly Viking Age. My camp tool collection is somewhat incomplete. There's a few things we don't have yet, but we will. For example, the head knife. We do have examples of blades very similar to this, found in England and in France. I'm not 100% sure there's been some of these found in Scandinavia, but it does fall into our era for the craftsmen. And a lot of these were, I forget the actual name, but they were head knife hybrids, and they had an awl. So this was still a blade like this, but then some material was removed, and there was actually a spike, so you could actually punch holes and perform cuts. So almost everything I make for Viking reenactment, I use this head knife to cut out the actual material itself. And they're really sharp. You got to maintain these. Use them on a strop, jeweler's rouge. There's a lot of info out there on how to maintain really sharp blades. Guys who work with wood have the same thing. You're constantly having to hone your steel. Next thing is this little antler knife. And I use this for doing a lot of my tooling. I don't use the swivel knife where you have the little cup under your finger and the rotating blade. I use this for everything, and it is possible to create curves with this if you're real careful. But I kind of like it. It's like a very miniature Brokeback Sax. Very, very thin, flexible blade. I don't ever really use the edge. It's just the tip that I occasionally maintain. It's really simple little tooling knife for doing small details. So this sheath, for example, hopefully a close-up will show it. There's some line work, things of that nature on there. And this was the knife I used for doing that. So while we're already holding it, here's my awl. So I kind of have an integrated sheath to protect this really sharp awl. So I use it for punching holes in a lot of different things. Pricking forks are they are period authentic. I just don't have a set of forged iron pricking forks. They basically look like a fork, and you hammer those through the leather to punch your holes essentially. And if you're really careful, you can use an awl to do the same thing. You don't necessarily have to use a pricking fork. The awl gets used for even tooling in some cases. It's great for getting into a line that you might cut with your actual blade. You can get in there and kind of increase and go across the top of the leather and slightly lower your blade of the awl into that cut and carefully dilate the cut a little bit. And that'll make an effect kind of like this, where we have a thicker line here, but this line was initially cut in with this tiny little blade. And I go through and I dilate the line with an awl or a dull sewing needle, something to just open it up a little bit more. We also have a burnisher, but this is also like a knot puller. Of course, this is deer antler. So on this part where we have the pithy interior of it, and this isn't a very pithy piece, and that's for a reason, we can use that to smooth edges of leather. It takes a bit of time. A lot of folks will use bone or horn or wood, but this one tends to work pretty well. And then this little point is great just for a general camp tool, flint knapping, opening a knot. You could use this for tooling too if you're just trying to create like buffed surfaces. Since these have very micro porous surfaces, I mean, they feel smooth, but there is micro porousness. You can actually slowly but surely polish the surface of something with it. It's really cool. And then in combination with beeswax even can create a really nice burnish. So that's a burnisher, and we can also use it to work inside of like crevices and work your stitch lines. It's a cool little tool. And this one kind of just naturally came out this shape when I was cutting other antler up. Beeswax nugget. I use this all the time on my linen thread, so we'll get into linen thread now. So we have wax linen thread, and it's just spun. So it's not the most sturdy stuff, but it really is once it's spiraled really well and waxed really well. Linen thread holds up. It's a beast. So I try to only use linen thread in these pouches. It holds up pretty well if we get a good saddle stitch. One of the things we're going to talk about. But with your little cube, you can basically just decide how much wax you want to put on this. When you're doing a really big project and you're using one piece of string, it's really good to occasionally take your needles off the string and re-wax it, because going through those holes over and over again will start to unwax your string. So wax linen thread, I can never have enough of it. Really good stuff. You just don't want to yank the holy heck out of it when you're doing your thing. So the next thing is just some little convenience-based leather pouch. This isn't exactly a historical item. Feasible enough, but I keep a good store of leather tools in here. So we got iron scissors. These are particularly, maybe not Viking or medieval, but they did have shears and scissors similar to this. And if you get a really nice forged pair of iron scissors, they will cut through pretty thick leather. And I do a fair share of leather cutting with these. They're a little overkill just for cutting your string. We have a smaller pair of iron snips for that. So we're getting through some of the basic tools here. And then we have another awl, but this is kind of a pricking fork. It's a single pricking fork, so maybe a heavier duty project. It's a really sharp point. This is also a multi-purpose item. You can use this in camp. You can use this as an eating pick, something for cooking utensil. Also good for tooling even. It's a sharp little point. With your maul, you can create really kind of intricate dot works with this. This is a little more crudely made tool, but this will kind of create like a little circular impression in leather with a slight void in the middle, kind of like the circle dot pattern. So you can go around and tap that through. I also use this for repairing stuff in camp if we need to, if something has to be punched through, or you break an axe and you have to get the extra wood out of the eye of the axe. This is a pretty cool little punch for that. And another punch, this is like a modern item, but they did have some iron versions of this, and wood and bone, antler I mean, for stamping, and for stamping usually on leather. So this is made by Wahlberg Forged. It's like a tool steel thing, so it's not Viking Age, but a triangular punch head, very much a thing for my era. And if you really get the hang of it, you can punch, shift over, flip, punch, shift over, and you can start to create some pretty cool patterns with it. And this one I just put an extra, hole in the middle. There's quite a few Anglo-Saxon and Viking punch styles that we have examples of. So we do have some period artwork that helps us kind of understand what the decorations might be like. And it's fairly well understood that if you were not poor, like really poor, you would have had some pretty decorated items. So when we have things like lengths of leather strap, there would have been some sort of embellishing on it. Like, why not? I kind of get it, and it's not adding a whole lot of cost. And if there's already a general understanding of skill and artwork for your particular class, you'd probably have some decoration. And if you were outfitting yourself from, let's say, just a couple smiths, you'd have a lot of cohesion. You'd have a lot of things that would probably match pretty well. But once again, for a higher status individual. So I think we almost made it through the tools. What else do I store in here? I think we had a needle case. Got another miniature little punch or tooling item. Just little tiny iron tools. I tend to use all of these when I work. And then we have a very unexciting but functional needle case. Just a wooden needle case. So I also keep sharp fabric needles in here, as well as my big dull saddle stitching needles. Ones at the time could have been made of iron, wood, horn, bronze, of course. But this one, it's arguable. Is it a silver needle? Eh. But anyways, stitching needles usually are somewhat dulled. They will stab you. But we'll get into a couple things that make this video worth your while for visiting, other than just talking about a couple tools. So we'll make a little bit of space. What I really wanted to show is how I do my triple weave pattern, which is a really simple thing, but I see a lot of folks attempt it and it gets kind of wonky looking. And you can do it freehand. It's be a cool skill to learn if you're just crafting something out, making yourself a belt, you want to throw the weave on there. I'd love to show you guys how that's done, and just an easy methodology for it, perhaps, as well as giving you guys a little insight on how I saddle stitch. I've watched a lot of folks saddle stitch and make saddle stitch videos, but I've never seen them do it quite the way I do it. And it seems like the way they do it might add a step or two. And why do that? But maybe I'm completely wrong, but my stitching still works fine. So I don't know. Why don't we go over a saddle stitch real quick? Let's see if I can get good camera angles and get all this figured out so you guys can see really what we're talking about. So the basics of a saddle stitch, since we will assume you guys don't know what that is. We start off with one length of string, right? And that string's going to be trimmed, and you're going to put a needle on both ends. So right here we got our 2 needles, 2 leads of string. Now when this pouch was started, it went through here, the very top. So you can just envision getting a string through one hole, equal amounts on each side. So essentially all a saddle stitch is a figure 8. So this blank space between my hands is the leather material. So your thread each thread goes on each side of it, comes back through and crosses. It's a very tight stitch, and it just starts from one loop end. So that's the basics of what that stitch is doing. There's a lot of different kinds of stitches. We won't go through that, but you have like running stitches, ones that just kind of go through. You have ones that double back. After they've gone through, they double back. There's a lot of different types. The herringbone stitch, blanket stitch. There's a lot of cool ways to do it, but I find saddle stitch holds really well, and for a lot of my work I tend to just use saddle stitching. So now that we're where we're at, a lot of these methods have this like front side, back side to your stitch line, where you're going to have your top stitch is going to look a certain level of uniformity, and your inside stitch will have a certain level of uniformity with a very slight difference in it. One will have a slight more angular twist, and the other one's kind of a little bit more of a straight almost kind of machine sewn line. What I find when I do it this way, I get both sides to look the same, both slightly angled, but kind of almost in between, completely vertical and slightly angled. So I just take my first needle, we'll get it through both pieces, which sometimes is easier said than done, depending on how thick your leather is. This one might take me a sec to figure out. And every once in a while you gotta put a needle back through the other side just to make your entrance a little more visible. There we go. So we're through both layers here. So we will just pull it all the way through. Doesn't have to be tight on the back side. So here we go. So there. And it's the top one we just put through. So we'll keep that down and out of the way. I find keeping it above or under doesn't make a difference. Prove me wrong, but we'll see. And now we're going to go back through with the other side. Okay, so now we got string number 2. We're going to go back through and directly on top of the other one, passing that thread that made it through here. So that's the one I just put through earlier. It's going to pass it. It's not going to jack up that thread at all. So I'll pull this part back out and I'll show you what other folks tend to do and why they do that. So before they pull their saddle stitches tight, they tend to have both little loops kind of out and ready to go, and then they'll pull it tight and both loops will go together. But I find that if the one side's already down and this side's down, we just get a little bit of tension and we're there and we're going. A lot of the methods they show will do this, which I don't want to do to this pouch because I don't know why people advise this so much. They'll put the string through halfway. They'll use smaller needles sometimes, but also feed the other needle in at the same time, and that just really blows out your hole. It just makes these already tight-fitting punched holes way too large. There's no reason to send an extra steel shaft through it. It'll just widen it, and my theory is that it's just going to loosen, make your stitching really loose. We're just running through again. We just did the opposite side, and I just alternate and just patiently take my time and not jack up the thread that's already through there. Just really do your very best not to scratch that thread, tear it. That's like the risk of my method, perhaps. But we get a really nice tight saddle stitch. It's going to take some time to finish this pouch, and it's a really stiff gusset on here. But like I was saying earlier, this is an enlarged Birka bag, so it's a little bit more suited towards what we have to carry when we do events, meaning this will fit a cell phone. This is going to one of the members of my group. I hope she'll like this, but there's a nice amount of capacity on this. And the way we mount it up too, we put some hand-peened copper rivets through it. Makes a really sturdy construction. One little thing that I've done on these that have made them a little more comfortable to wear is that when you're suspending this strap will kind of turn. And I've seen this on all of them, like not the ones, just the ones I make. So when you have your bridge through here, and your pouch is essentially on your belt, you kind of get this like wobble. And your strap sometimes will look weird. So I end up adding an extra rivet up here, and it keeps it nice and stable, and you're still able to lift your strap up and open your pouch. But I make a smaller version of this, one that's a little closer to the example itself. So we did our little saddle stitching lesson, so I hope you guys like that. Next thing, what I really want to talk about is doing this pattern. It's a pretty enlarged version of it, and I kind of wing it when I do it. But we will move the camera and show you guys how we do that. But first, we have a blank piece. And to start, a little bit of water. So I'll wet this and show you just how wet I get it. Not a whole lot, but not a teeny tiny bit. And with this pattern, since we're not doing like detailed shading and things like that, like a more fancy tooled piece, letting the leather set to like a particular stiffness isn't particularly required. But I'm just getting it nice and evenly damp. Most of the time this leather will soak this up. So we really just kind of got the surface wet. Somewhat evenly. So we'll let this set for a little bit. And basically what this is vegetable tanned leather. Meaning that they didn't use metals particularly to tan this. So when it's still raw living flesh, it goes through a lot of processes that it would have for thousands of years. We do now have like modern tanning where they have some very advanced chemicals and blends of heavy metals even that will penetrate dye. It'll dye the leather all the way through. It cures it. It gets it really ready to go. But veg tan, they tend to only use plant acids and things like that. There's a whole chemical process that I'm not entirely familiar with, but they do use bark. So bark is a pretty big thing, and there's tannic acid in a lot of stuff. So there is all kinds of cool bushcraft methods for tanning and curing hides and skin. But this is kind of the closest thing we're going to get to something that would have been early Middle Ages cow leather. Even then, cow leather wasn't so much a thing. You'd find a lot of really interesting animal products on Viking Age leather crafts, seal and whale, ray. Like there's some really interesting stuff. But this is really kind of what we've come to as modern reenactors. We do have a lot more bovine leather than we probably should. Livestock was totally a thing, but on the level it is, and just it would have been a little different in those days. So this is just about set up. So I'm gonna pause it and we're gonna get started again and show how we do this. We're gonna be using this blade here. So we'll see you in a second. All right, we are back. We are looking at our veg tan leather strip. 2.5 inch leather strip. It's a 4 ounce. So to do our triple weave, or even a double weave like we have here on this pouch, really just getting your first couple lines started is the biggest thing. And I usually like to take this little corner here and just envision like the corner of a page folded over. See what I mean? Like dog-eared. And I just eyeball it, give myself some even spacing. Sorry, we'll try to correct the focus. There we go. So there's our first 3 lines, and the key is to flip it over. But I tend to take it at this angle and have the point face off directly from myself, and then I will cut back towards myself. So I put that tip of that piece out, and I cut back towards myself with even spacing. And on your inside weave, you just don't go all the way to the edge of your previous cut. We'll flip it over. And in this case, I'm cutting back towards my right hip. So we do some even spacing again. 1, 2, 3. We're getting there. And really the flipping is the biggest annoying thing. When I have a really long belt, you can imagine I'm flipping over this big length of belt. It gets annoying. Once again, we got that tip straight off to ourselves. But even in this case, sorry, kind of janky lighting there. Now those lines I cut are facing back towards me. So still, my cutting angle is going to be the same on this next side through, cutting back towards myself. And try to get a good knife for this, one that doesn't have any forward blade. That way it's not spilling over onto the previous line and giving you some kind of bad craftsmanship. And cut all the way to that edge. These weaves tend to kind of not look as stunning if you can really see where these lines terminate. So that's just a little bit of advice to make these look a little better for you guys. And this right here is actually a pre-prepared gusset. So I'm just kind of getting ahead of the curve and making another gusset for one of these. It is the right length and everything. And how I do that, once we have our full pattern, I run a beveler through the edge. If you're really surgical and you have a sharp knife, you can cut your own bevel on these edges. They're not exactly necessary on an inside gusset. but I do bevel that edge there. I hope it would focus, but probably won't. But you'll cut your bevel, and then things like a set of wing dividers looks a lot like a compass. You can actually do a consistent line here to give yourself a guideline for punching your holes. So the way I'm able to get this to this shape is I soak this leather. I get it nice and wet, usually with just cool water. If I'm trying to harden it, we would try something else. We have a little visitor, Stellar J. He's just wondering if I got anything shiny or tasty. Yeah. So we get this completely wet, and then I essentially fold it in on itself and then start to crank it out into a shape like this. And while it's drying, I have to tend to it a good few times to make sure I'm getting this wet form that I want. We'll definitely make another YouTube video for making a puukko knife sheath. I have a really cool traditionally made puukko from a friend. And what a puukko is a small utility knife. They're really an old thing. Puukko, I believe, is related to the Finnish version of that blade. So that's going to be a cool sheath to make. We're going to try to make that the way traditional puukko sheaths were made, with they have a seam stitch instead of an edge stitch like that, so we actually will have a back seam to it. That'll be an interesting creation, so we'll definitely key you guys in on all of that. And I might even add some copper sheet decoration to that sheath. Now, we went over most of our tools, some punches, some knives, wet forming, how to saddle stitch perhaps easier, and doing our triple weave. And why don't we just cut one more set of 3 while we're here. And for those of you interested in more of the history, I'm going to put some links in the description for the York Institute's Viking Leathercraft archaeological record. It's got all kinds of interesting things in there, even some clothing information, examples of the shoes. There's some photographs of actual finds. So I will include that in the link. And I hope you guys just have a good one, and it's been a pleasure.